Good morning. New week. Awesome. Good stuff. So we are going to spice it up a little bit. We're going to move on a little bit because there's a lot to discuss. What I want to do in the next few sessions, we'll see how it pans out, is we're going to move away for a short while from the strict technical halachic analysis, and we need to try and put all the various challenges, if that's the right word, into a social context, into a cultural context. And to have an understanding, we have to discuss feminism. So let me sketch out the some of the ideas, or some of the very specific and technical challenges that you will come across. And some of these words you may be familiar with, and some of them perhaps are less relevant in Germany or less, but you absolutely need to be educated, need to know about them. So I'm going to throw out some terms, some of which are Jewish, well, allegedly, or rather they operate within parts of the Jewish world, and some of them are much broader. The patriarchy.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Have you heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
You have? Good. Okay, I'm just checking. I don't know. Forgive me if I assume too much or too little. The patriarchy. I could be much. I could be the cis-normative hetero patriarchy. I mean, it comes in all sorts of flavors. Whether it's wage gap, equality of outcome, equality of opportunity, partnership minyonim. Do you know what that is? Okay. Partnership minyonim. And here I am not equating any of these things for the purposes of the recording, because I had a challenge, a query from somebody who was kind enough to actually listen to these shiurim and took me to task for seeming to equate to the following two terms, yoatzot and maharat or rabbah. Are you familiar with these terms? Kind of. Okay, so I'm not making any equivalence between them. I'm throwing out merely some terms, some ideas, some positions, which in some areas of orthodoxy, and that itself is a debate, how broad is the tent? And at what point does one find oneself outside of it? And we'll discuss that a little bit also. So these are some of the things. So different roles that hitherto were not taken by women, being taken by women in some areas of orthodoxy, such as a yoetzet, right? Poskot, sometimes the word is used. Rabbah, maharat. Now, some of them clearly are very, very, very far on the left and debatable whether they're even within orthodoxy. And then you have, even to the extent of women rabbis, so-called. And I'm talking about those that don't claim to be. You see, if somebody identifies as, and I don't mean it in that sense, but if somebody identifies as part of the conservative movement, or Masorti, depending on which part of the world you are, right? Or progressive, or reconstructionist, or reform, or gastronomic, or I don't know, all the various other branches of Judaism, so-called branches of Judaism. That's one thing. It is, from our perspective, it is lamentable. Every Jew is our brother, our sister, and we have nothing. We wish nothing more for him or her than to be exposed to the light and the beauty of what we consider to be authentic Torah, which should be the enrichment and the fulfillment of their neshama. But the reality is otherwise, and very conscious of the fact that we're sitting here in Berlin, which was the cradle of Reform Judaism, in the famous words of the Meshech Chochmah, the prescient words of the Meshech Chochmah. Remember, he died in 1926. Yomru Berlin hu Yerushalayim. Famous essay in Pashas B'Chukoisai. I don't need to tell you, you know all about it. So a number of these terms and ideas people claim are orthodox. There is at least one organization, say here in Berlin, which I think, nominally claims to be Orthodox. It's not our purpose here to either to name names or to go into, but I don't think they are. That's my own personal opinion for various reasons. So, but we need to have an understanding, right? Women having aliyos, Kriyas HaMegillah, for themselves, for other groups of women, for men. These are all issues that are
On the way.
well, no, they're here already. This is a reality. This is a reality. And the question is, we're going to look, so we need to look not just at the halacha, which we will do as well. So for example, minoi sororo is the technical term. I'll go more further than that. Women being synagogue presidents. What would be if, let's say, for our Vorstand now, for example, a woman were to stand? What about a vice president? What about a woman being a dayan, an aide? A lot of these things are very clear and explicit in halacha. Some of them possibly slightly less so. Yes.
How's a president connected to halacha? Like, what's a...
That's good. That's why. Oh, I'm really glad. So we're going to discuss that. Absolutely. That it absolutely is a halachic question. So, I mean, without Soim Tosim Alecha Mel Mikerev Achecha. Kol Mesimas Shatosam should only be Me'achecha. And how far does that go? Can a woman be a mashgiach for kashrus, etc., etc.? And that is the truth from Rabbi Moshe about that. These are all. And to what extent is it about ne'monos, or to what extent is it about what it means to be a woman? Okay, so with those few introductory comments, all I've done is sketched out the issues, some of which are negea right here, some of which are in broader, even within Orthodoxy. See, there was a time when it was very clear. That was almost a litmus test. Yeah, if you had mixed pews and you had, I don't know, a mixed choir, or you had women giving a sermon or something, a woman wearing tefillin. I forgot even to mention that. We're going to go through some of that. Women wearing tefillin, right? In a so-called Orthodox high school in Manhattan, Ramaz, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken. SARS, I've got to check. I don't want to... and we'll go through that. We'll look at Rav Heschel Schachter's tshuvas on this. So one thing is undeniable. Starting with the 1960s, there was and is a feminist movement. We're not going to go into the technicalities of it. If you're interested, I'm going to give this to you, not today, which is a very good summary of the so-called three waves of feminism. If you're interested in the literature, we'll go through this, okay? And the question is, and there is no shaila that a lot, if not all, of what we are seeing, all of these various things, are a response to it. The impact has come from without, not from within. Yes? It is Jews, some secular, some liberal, but some more recently even within Orthodoxy, being... One has to be careful what one says, because you can't overgeneralize. You cannot say that every woman who wants to learn Torah or who wants to put on tefillin is rejecting the Dvar Hashem. I'm sure there are those that Asher Kirvas Elokim Lohem Toiv. They want to become closer to the Rabbinerseminar. Let's assume that. But at the same time, I think we mustn't kid ourselves and be absolutely realistic that the concepts and where they're coming from, many, if not most of them, is coming from another place. It's coming from something that is without Yiddishkeit. Let's start to analyze this a little bit. And the first point is a very basic hashkafic point. Very basic and really, really important. Some conversations that I've had over the years. A woman says, why do only you as a man have the right to be part of a minyan, to get an aliyah, to be a rav, or whatever it is? This is discrimination, right? Why is there the so-called glass ceiling, that there are limitations placed on women in the Torah world? We've got to get modern. We've got to get into the 21st century. We've got a lot of catching up to do. Women have to be seen as being equal in every way. The basic problem with that, the mistake, let's say that, what is the basic mistake with that? The basic mistake is as follows. Before we go any further, it needs to be absolutely crystal clear. We're living in a society where the touchstone of civilization, it's all based on rights. It's all based on rights. I have a right to the same job, to the same wage, to the same position in society. Any area that you have access to, I demand to be treated equally and to have access to that. And then we can argue, you can go down the whole Jordan Peterson road, which is very interesting, about whether it's equality of outcome or equality of opportunity and all that sort of stuff. But whichever way you look at it, that's why I don't really even want to get into that, because we mustn't even go there. Why? Because what that is saying fundamentally is, you have a right, and therefore I am no less of a human being. I have a brain, I have personality, I should be given access to have exactly the same rights that you have. And this, and at that level, feminism fails at the first hurdle, as we say, to use the sporting metaphor from a Jewish perspective. Why? Because there are no rights in Judaism. There are implied rights, of course, but there are no rights per se. We have only duties and obligations. 613 chiyuvim, mitzvahs, outward-looking obligations towards self, other, and Hashem. In that order, and that's a maral, that's not hashkafa shir for now.
Now the feminists could step in and say, every Jew has the 613, so the women should also have those obligations.
Oh, I'll analyze that in a second. First of all, let's not forget, I think I've told you this before, how many mitzvahs hasei shazman groma are there?
14.
14.
Yeah.
So you already have, 98% of, but that's not enough. You want more.
Yeah.
You want more. So I'm not going to do the cynical thing, which I could and should do, perhaps. The cynical thing, this is what I'm not going to do. Let me tell you what I'm not going to do. With a twinkle in my eye. What I'm not going to do is say, right, you want more. That means you're not satisfied with all the things that you've got. That means you are makbid on every area of tznius, which is undoubtedly primarily yours. Men have tznius as well. But, so you're covering your hair properly. You're really machmir, but it's not enough. You want more. You want more chiyuvim. Right. All the feminists are always perfectly attired. Yes? Really? That's a cynical thing. I won't do that. Okay, I won't do that. I wouldn't do that because that's not nice. And I'm sure there are some who, what you can't do is take every leniency in Hilchos Tznius, whilst at the same time championing and jumping up and down and shouting and demanding to have more chiyuvim. If you're keeping your chiyuvim properly, not using the most lenient opinion that you can possibly find, you can't have you've got to be consistent. If it is kirvas elikim that you're really after, and I'm sure there are those for who that is so, but don't show up in slacks. Don't show up with your elbows on show, or with a tefach of your hair showing, because there is such a Rav Moshe, maybe perhaps depending on how you understand it, but you want to have an aliyah. And I'm feeling a bit passionate today, if I'm really honest, because I don't know whether you saw in the news yesterday, a woman decided to strip down to her underwear in front of the Kaisel. Okay, a loony, maybe, fine, yeah. Yes. And I'm not everything that goes on in Eretz Yisrael on any side of the fence is I'm particularly happy about, unfortunately. It's sad. It becomes the whole discussion has become very shrill, very personal and very ad hominem. It's not nice. It's really not nice. There's very little Kiddush Hashem going on, sadly, tragically on both sides of it. Mm-hmm. But hopefully we can try and do better. But let's not forget, we're talking about chiyuvim. We're talking about obligations. What are you saying? First of all, the very basis of that premise that any right a man should have, you should have, which is the whole tone of the debate in secular society, that doesn't get off the ground in Yiddishkeit. I don't have any rights at all. I have to get out of bed every morning. I have a chiyuv. I don't have a choice. I have a chiyuv. I only have chiyuvim. I have chiyuv to get out of bed and be in davening early and put on tefillin every day. I was having a conversation with a girl last week, talking about various things, and she'd taken some days off work. And she said the nicest part of it all was just to be able not to set the alarm. She was taking a few days off work so she could just sleep and wake up whenever. And because we'd also been speaking other stuff as well, I just threw in a comment. I said, wow. I said, that must be really, really nice. She said, what do you mean it must be really nice? I said, I wouldn't know. There's no such thing for a Jewish man. It does not exist. That concept of just being in bed and whatever, unless you're ill, God forbid, doesn't exist. And she stopped and she said, oh, right. Never thought of it in those terms. I said, yeah, people don't. It's the glitz and the glamour that the people are often after. I don't have any rights. I have a chiyuv. A Jew always asks himself, have I fulfilled my chiyuv? That is the fundamental discourse and relationship between us and even and self and other and the Rabbinerseminar. That's Yiddishkeit. So therefore, before we go any further, the whole narrative, the whole discourse, the basic values that underpin all of these discussions, which may or may not be correct. I have no problem. Women can get the same wage. Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they be CEOs of corporations and do whatever they can do? Lama lo. And from a Jewish perspective, we don't have a problem with that. If, however, you are saying that it is unjust, and here is where I do have a problem. If, and it's an if what you are saying is it is unfair, you're basically saying that the Torah, as it has always been lived and understood, al Masorah, by Chazal, by al Gedolim throughout the generations, if you're saying, I cannot accept that, I think it's wrong, it's unfair, it's bad, then it's a rejection fundamentally of Torah and the system of Torah. Well, they will say, it's because these were all men and they colored it, and different people will be more outspoken and some people will be a little bit more respectful, but that's really what they're saying. Even a lot of the Orthodox ones is, well, it's because the Chazon Ish was a man and the Chofetz Chaim was a man, and women had no, leaving aside Devorah, which is an interesting anomaly, of course there were some learned women, and not to be for a second mistaken for a lack of respect for what a woman is. The Rambam says, "Oy havo kegufay umechabdo yosem migufay." Towards a man, towards one's wife, love her as yourself and give her respect more than yourself. There were lots of protections in Jewish law, such as a ksuba and other things, and that she gets a ksuba paid first before the debtors, etc. Long before modern society thought of any of these things. I think I've mentioned to you also, ironically, rape within marriage only became a thing in Western democracies in the last 20 years. Max. It's been osur in halacha from the get-go. Wow. So, but even if we don't get there, the problem is if a person approaches Torah, and this is really the problem, if you approach Torah, and that is why I often, when I'm interacting with very secular, whether it's the students or whatever, who, if they're coming from another hole, that they're not ready to hear this at all, and there's actually almost no point saying it. They can't even hear this. To approach, you cannot approach Torah with the 21st century mindset of women have to be equal in every single way, because then the conclusion is the Torah is wrong, or the Torah as it has been interpreted. And nobody ever has a problem with the Chumash, very rarely. It's always the rabbis, and they're male, and that's the underlying narrative. To some it's more clear, more outspoken. And the other thing is the idea that we need to fix the Torah. We need to fix it. There's something that needs fixing. It's somehow gone out of, the rest of society has progressed. We are treating women well. Debatable, actually, by the way, whether we are, but that's another whole story. The family's in a much worse state. But even if we don't go down any of those routes, to try and shoehorn Torah into 21st century secular, Western, liberal, progressive values is just false. And instead of standing back and saying, this HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man, he created woman. They are different. They have different strengths. They have different roles. And there are some roles which are only designed for men. And that is, there's no way to sugarcoat that aspect of it. Yes, it is very much out of sync with what 21st century secular, progressive, liberal, Western values, democratic values tell us. Yes, there is no way you can sugarcoat that. That is what it is.
Maybe because it has to be.
That is Yiddishkeit.
Right.
So it then becomes, to some extent, now here is where where it becomes complicated, because there are, most notably in modern Orthodoxy, kind of across the board a little bit, the idea that somehow we need to try and respond because we have a problem. If we are educating our women folk in universities, in very much as part of society, and they're very much part of Western secular culture, then they see there's a disparity. And there's two ways. You either swallow the bitter pill of the Torah patriarchy, and they're not ready to do that. Many of them. Some are. They're not ready to do that. So what do? So there have been some. So here's where we've been through the Chafetz Chaim and all that sort of stuff. That's as far as the Gedolim went. On the left, you have the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Soloveitchik advocating the teaching of Gemara as a lechatchila. And that is now definitely an orthodox view, no question about it. It's not the mainstream in terms of the so-called yeshiva world, but it is absolutely and I need to keep meaning to photocopy. There's a tshuva from the Sridei Eish, which I want to go through with you, where he also is more on that side kind of thing. We want to do that inside, but I'll do that maybe for tomorrow. And then you have, have you heard of open orthodoxy? The term. Okay. I wouldn't want to spend too much time in it. So I'll tell you what I have. The two papers that I've prepared for you for today. This was an introduction. So I've taken an appendix from Ner LaElef, and it's not totally up to date, but it's up to date enough. Okay. So you've had the three waves of feminism. What has been the effect? So I've already sketched out to some extent the effect. Secular Jews. The first thing to notice here is that many leading feminists were Jewish. Gloria Steinem, Blue Greenberg. She is the famous one that said, where there is a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way. I mentioned that already. Levi, Kotin, Pogrebin, Deborah, Golda, and me, whatever. In earlier decades, Jewish marriage rate were higher than the national average. In the 70s, there was a 200% increase in Jewish women not marrying, which is 5% above the general population, and the Jewish divorce rate soared. In the 50s, the Jewish birth rate was 2.8%, 67. These are across the board, and these are mainly in statistics from the US. In 67, 1.75%, in 70, 1.6%, in 90, 1.45%. Gloria Steinem, a quote, I either give birth to someone else or I give birth to myself. Many rabbis and Jewish leaders express their fear. This is a quote from Gail Schulman. Many rabbis and Jewish leaders express their fear that reluctance to produce large families present a threat to the survival of Judaism itself. This seems little more than an attempt to arouse a woman's guilt for jeopardizing the future of Judaism by daring to consider her own needs first. Blue Greenberg, quote, mainstream feminism has attacked the basic structures and life values that Judaism has contributed to human society. So, and then you have something which you can Google on your own. There's something called JOFA, the Jewish Organization of Feminine. I don't remember the rest of it. JOFA. We'll come across them a little bit later when we talk about partnership minyanim. Okay. Now, what about women's liberation movement within Orthodoxy? So here is a quote from the Sridei Eish. Okay. Chelik Beis Samaches. Benois hadoir yesh lahem regesh shel kovod atzmai. The women of the generation, in his day already, just post Second World War, have a feelings of self-respect. Ba'arotzos k'may Ashkenaz v'Tzarfat hanoshim margishos elboin upegia b'zechiyosehem. In Germany and in France, women feel a shame and that their rights have been attacked If we won't allow them to participate even by singing, they see that as discrimination. Okay? So, there were a few Orthodox women participated in the broader women's liberation movement, which began in the 60s. By the 70s, there were already complaints voiced by Orthodox women and feminists, and they were soon to find a pseudo-rabbinic voice. Rabbi Saul Berman, in his 1973 article in Tradition, women complained they did not have enough expression in ritual areas like prayer. They were disadvantaged according to halacha in marriage and divorce arrangement, and they played second fiddle to their husbands, helping them to learn Torah without having the opportunity to do so themselves. Rabbi Berman even suggested that we add ksuvim readings to the Haftarah to be read by women in front of men. The impression developed amongst, and it's important to notice that we're not talking about conservative, right? We're not talking about movements that do not even claim to be Orthodox. Okay. Mm-hmm. The impression developed amongst these women was that all that was holding up the reform to their way of thinking was the desire of the rabbis to want that it be that way. The infamous saying, I quoted this to you already, where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way, was coined. However, it was only in the last 20 years that Orthodox women began a formal Orthodox women's movement. This was supported by rabbis such as Avi Weiss and Henkin, and the Jewish observers dealt exclusively with it. I'll give you, it started quite a while ago. I'll give you some articles on that. Then let's move on. The desire of some women to be men. Now here's a really interesting, just a comment. Again, I'm certainly no expert on feminism, but I remember having a conversation with quite an ardent feminist, and I was saying, have you not created the equivalent of an own goal? So what you're saying is, to quote from The Lion King, so, I want to be like you, right? So basically what you're saying is, you men can do this, we wanted to be like you. No, I thought the whole idea surely should be that you should be women. Otherwise you're just aping men. But men are the problem. I mean, I wouldn't even go round to the radical feminists. The famous line: "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." The phrase that was coined. No, you haven't come across that one. Okay, but by setting up men as the paradigm, putting up men on a pedestal, and then saying, right, you can be a CEO, so we can be a CEO. In other words, what you're doing is you're saying this is an ideal. So I want to be like that. Instead of saying, well, stop a minute, let me think about what does it mean to be a strong, powerful woman? To be feminine. Instead of reimagining that and reshaping that to think, instead you've said, right, man is the ideal, and therefore whatever you can do, we want to do. It's pretty obvious. You're just copying it. So the desire of some women to be men. In New York, this movement has expressed itself by having women's minyanim, calling women up to the Torah, having women wear talesim, sometimes a tefillin, other expressions which are technically legal, and that we're going to deal with, okay? Women's prayer groups, but clearly express women's desire to imitate their male fellow Jews. In addition, some women began to say Kaddish even at regular minyanim. Again, I must stress, this is not necessarily a halachic problem. We're not even talking about, in my own shul, and certainly in London, I made accommodation and that women could say Kaddish. It's not, we'll go into some of the technicalities, but that just to be clear, that's not necessarily by any means osa, but it's where is this coming from? What is this saying? It's that I want to do whatever you men can do. We want to be like men and be right. This desire of women to feel that women's liberation, becoming men, was integral to the broader women's liberation movement of the 60s. The movement subsequently realized that women must focus more on giving expression to uniquely women's values and qualities. And therefore, really, perhaps the Orthodox movement is a little bit behind. But okay. There is no question that the Orthodox women's movement draws from that part of Orthodoxy whose commitment is weakest. It is never those who are most observant, who would seemingly have the most reason to want to do more, who are at the forefront of these movements. Thus, women's issues were featured recently at a conference in Israel on modern Orthodoxy, sponsored by Beit Morasha, a radically anti-Haredi institution of higher learning, Kibbutz Hadati. the Israeli alumni of Yeshiva University and the Jewish Agency, Kibbutz Ner Etzion. This is, and we kind of made the point already. This is the background, okay? And there are some quotes here which I'm going to leave you with, which are problematic.
What about, is the meaning of a woman saying Bekas HaGoyma at the bris for her son?
I'm not familiar with that, but we can research that. I'll research that. That could be one of them. Oh, not at the bris. A woman says "Agomel" in shul after she has a baby, for sure. They do that in Gateshead. Do it everywhere. Yeah, woman says "Agomel." There are different minhagim. Sometimes the woman comes to shul and the man says "Agomel" for her. And in some kehilas, in my kehillah, we have the woman says "Agomel." Here we've had a woman saying "Agomel" many times. No problem. Now I have chosen deliberately. Whoa. I've chosen here in your other bundle 2 articles, both from Rabbeim within Yeshiva University, okay? Because for me, just to choose, to choose articles from Ami magazine or whatever, Lahavdil, big deal. We know where Haredi stands on this, so I thought it's much more useful and valuable to take 2 big Talmid Chachamim, very Chosheva Talmid Chachamim, that operate primarily within the Yeshiva University world. They're both Rabbeim within that world, okay? Rabbi Meir Tversky and Rabbi Mordechai Willig. Yeah? Mm-hmm. You heard of either of them? Rabbi Mordechai Willig is the Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University. Let's start with him. Let's start backwards. He wrote an article, sorry.
Related to Avram Tversky?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So let's start with Rabbi Mordechai Willig. Again, this article is, I have to find the date of it. It was written a while ago. It's not a new article, but I think it's worthwhile. 2015. Okay, 2015. And he called this article, and it provoked quite some controversy within his own community. But let's go. He called it "Trampled Laws," and I'll put the link to this article on the YouTube video. The Mefarshim provide multiple interpretations of the opening phrase of Parshas Eikev. The simplest interpretation is that of the Chizkuni, who explains Eikev to mean Bishvil, because. So the pasuk means, because you will listen to these laws, you will get Hashem's blessing. Rashi connects the word Eikev to heel, an akev, to understand the pasuk to telling us that we get Hashem's blessing if we listen to the easy mitzvahs. Right? Mitzvahs which people are dosh ba'akev, they trample with their heels. Like Rashi, Ramban understands Eikev also to be a heel, but he explains the heel to refer to the end. So Ramban understands the pasuk to tell us the end result of your observance will be Hashem's reward. Fine. The Rechaim says V'hoya is an expression of joy, and he offers 3 interpretations. Either joy is only achieved at the end of something, or it is the joy of Torah study is itself the reward, or finally, the Rechaim explains that when Am Yisrael tries best to learn and understand Torah, Hashem rejoices, and as a result, the whole world is happy. Fine. Finally, the Kli Yakar explains Eikev to refer to Chukim, whose mitzvahs, whose reasons are not apparent to us. Chukim are precisely the mitzvahs people are most likely to trample on, because everybody says, well, why are you doing something you don't understand? In an age of reason, don't do things you don't understand. So the Kli Yakar contrasts the previous pasuk, which explicitly mentions both Chukim and Mishpatim, with our pasuk, which only talks about Mishpatim and omits Chukim. And he explains this, and basically he's telling us, be makpid on everything. Okay, we're going to actually skip some of the Torah at the beginning of this, and I probably shouldn't. Here we go. Here's where he gets to the meat of the matter. These timeless interpretations must guide us in spiritually challenging times. We obey all of Hashem's laws, especially those that others trample on. We do so with joy and humility, especially when others demean and oppose us. Various gender issues are recent examples of areas wherein surrounding society demeans and opposes Hashem's laws. Hashem created male and female. He said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Rashi notes that women are to be more private than men and are exempted from the mitzvah of procreation. Women are also exempted from time-dependent mitzvahs and the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Nearly 40 years ago, Reb Moshe Feinstein Zatzal responded to what was then a new movement known as women's liberation. Some observant women wished to project that battle onto Jewish ritual observance by doing things like wearing a talis. Rabbi Moshe responded that the entire Torah was given by Hashem. It is impossible to change even one detail. He suggests that a reason for women's exemption from time-dependent mitzvahs in Talmud Torah is since that women are naturally more adept at raising children, which is the most important work for Hashem and for Torah, Hashem exempted them from time-dependent positive mitzvahs and time-consuming obligations of Talmud Torah. This exemption applies even if lifestyles change and women are able to arrange for others to care for their kids. Rav Moshe continued to say, no battle, even one supported by the entire world, can succeed in changing Torah, and women who fight to change the Torah's eternal and immutable laws are heretics. If that is indeed what is motivating them. If that is what you're saying, like I said before, if what you're saying is, I am unhappy, I think the Torah, as interpreted and lived and taught and observed for millennia, is misogynistic, it's a patriarchy, it is, fundamentally, it is wrong, that is heresy. If a woman wears talis or tefillin as a complaint against Hashem and his Torah, it is prohibited as heresy, since she thinks it is possible to change Torah law. Notice very clearly, it may be mutter for a woman to wear a talis or tefillin. That's not the point. It's very much about, and that's a halachic question which we'll look into. The question is, where is this coming from? What are you really saying? And only Hashem knows, usually, unless you say it loudly and clearly yourself. Rav Moshe adds that women's sanctity is equal to that of men. There is no degradation of their honor in the Torah, and there is no correct reason for them to complain. He concludes by charging a Rav to explain this each time that issues arise, to be strong and protest those women who refuse to listen and stubbornly adhere to wrong ideas, and to refuse any change to any holy minhag. The movement to which Rav Moshe refers, now known as feminism or egalitarianism, continues to infiltrate Orthodox Judaism. The recent ordination of women is but one example. Unfortunately, this practice is viewed by at least one of its proponents as part of an attempt to change Torah laws and ideas, precisely the heresy that Rav Moshe warned against. There's a yeshiva, so-called, the yeshiva called the Yeshivas Chayvavei Torah, part of so-called Open Orthodox movement. It's the flagship of the Open Orthodox movement. It claims both to be Orthodox whilst supporting and the ordination of women. And it gets round overt, clear a denigration of Torah by inventing all sorts of weasel words, and this woman is not a rabbi, she's a rabbah, and they have a yeshiva maharat, and all sorts of, it's rabbi and everything pretty much but name. And it's pretty obvious to anybody with half a brain. And therefore the RCA, of course Agudas Yisrael is going to denounce it, it goes without saying, but even the RCA, and we'll come to their statement a little bit later. It's happened, right? So this phenomenon may lead to a schism within Orthodoxy. In a very recent article, then 2015, Israeli Orthodox scholars indicate that the belief of liberals are really conservative, but they cling to Orthodoxy publicly because of identity and its association with authenticity. Mm-hmm. However, the blurring of boundaries between conservative and modern Orthodox Judaism undermines the very authenticity of self-defined modern Orthodoxy. Chazal discouraged Torah being taught to women, especially Talmud. The Gedolim of the 20th century, e.g. Chavetz Chaim, understood the directive of Chazal not to be a definitive ban on women's learning Torah, but rather guidance on what approach to women's chinuch would best encourage their adherence to the Masorah. Those Gedolim, guided by Yiras Shamayim, as well as an absolute mastery of Kol HaTorah Kula, understood that in the light of a weakened state of Masorah from one generation to another in the 20th century, Talmud Torah for women was a necessity to implant pure faith in their hearts, quote from Reb Zalman Sorotzkin, which we saw inside, if you remember. And as such was entirely consistent with Chazal's mandate to provide the most productive chinuch for women. However, in the words of a pioneer of the religious feminist wave cited in the aforementioned article, what is happening today is a direct continuation of the beginning of Talmud studies for religious women in the 1980s. This candid admission must, for the genuinely orthodox, call into question the wisdom of these studies. Let us just stop here. Let me just finish the paragraph. Although there are ample reliable sources that encourage individual women who have proper Yiras Shamayim and whose motives are consistent with our Masorah to further their Torah study, the inclusion of Talmud in the curricula for all women in modern Orthodox schools needs to be re-evaluated. While the Gedolim of the 20th century certainly saw Torah to be studied, to be a way to keep women close to our Masorah, an egalitarian attitude has colored some women's study of Talmud and led them to embrace and advocate egalitarian ideas and practices which are unacceptable to those very Gedolim. This is a Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University calling upon his own corner, his own side of the tent, to say that whilst it may well have been consistent with halacha, but look where it's taking us. Even say it's been hijacked, maybe. But he says now it needs to be, we can no longer, you can't deny the link between the inclusion of Talmud into the curricula and the consequence and the outcome is a reality of this egalitarian movement to advocate for total equality and a rejection of Torah as we know it. And therefore, he says, the curricula ought to be reevaluated. Let's just continue and finish this for today at least. Women's ordination and egalitarian minyanim, the primary subjects of the aforementioned article, are part of a broader issue of a questioning of one's exclusive and absolute truth. This is the postmodern attitude that questions the divinity, morality, and immutability of Torah law. Indeed, inclusivity and openness are, as their advocates concede, a response to the issues and challenges of the postmodern era. However, while modern orthodoxy, properly defined, is viable and possibly even desirable, postmodern or open orthodoxy seems to be an oxymoron. The precipitous move to the right within modern orthodoxy is in reality a rejection of postmodernism. In fact, 40 and 50 years ago, even conservative Judaism did not accept women's ordination. There's one manifestation of postmodernism, same-sex marriage. Another postmodern cause célèbre was rejected in decades past even by Reform Judaism. At the time, even they understood that homosexuality is more than a violation of a mere legal enactment and runs counter to the sancta of Jewish life. To officiate at a so-called marriage of two homosexuals is a contravention of all that is respected in Jewish life. And you have the sources, that is from a Reform responsa. Source number 3 over the page. Responsible open Orthodox rabbis concede that homosexual acts are and will always be prohibited by Torah law. The Ramban writes that the reason for the prohibition is obvious. It is abominable and does not lead to procreation. The first biblical command and the primary reason for marriage. Nevertheless, the response of some open Orthodox rabbis to the recent Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage is disappointing, to say the least. 2 days after the court issued its ruling, one wrote, in the modern Orthodox world, Mishkav Zacha is now mutter. On the day of the ruling, another open Orthodox rabbi wrote, it is not good for man to be alone. Mazel Tov, America. That posuk, in fact, describes the creation of woman to create a couple, not another man. In Western society today, biblical law and near universal historical attitudes are viewed as outdated and immoral. Unfortunately, even some Orthodox Jews who accept the prohibition against homosexuality as normative think that the Torah got it wrong. As a result, it's become a chok, a law viewed by some people as without a clear reason, contrary to the Ramban above. It is not surprising then that the Satan, the nations of the world, and even liberal Jews trample this mitzvah with their heels and tease Orthodox Judaism, which stubbornly clings to this eternal truth of Torah. Our resolve is now deserving of a greater reward for Hashem, since we rely on him against those who mock and deride us. Let's just finish. The claim that these acts are now mutter echoes the aforementioned article's statement regarding egalitarian minyanim. The train has left the station. What remains to be seen is the final destination of the train. Rabbis should not throw stones at the windows, but they are duty-bound to caution that the passengers, sooner or later, will likely no longer be part of the eternal Messiah community of authentic orthodoxy. And I have had some angst myself relating to other things going on here in Berlin. I don't want to say more. It's difficult. It's painful. It's painful. On the one hand, but as future rabbis, you need to know what is emes and what isn't emes. Of course, we deal with the reality, and we do so with empathy, with sensitivity, but we do not, in the name of openness and liberalism and being caring, throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, Chas v'sholom, Torah, or our Messiah and our halacha, as lived and interpreted by our chachamim for millennia, all of a sudden is wrong. Chas v'sholom. And it's as simple as that. That is the bottom line. We'll have a look tomorrow at what Rabbi Twersky says, and then we'll start looking at some of the halachas of some of these issues.